I'm actually interested in a new culture of learning in the context of a world of constant flux. I want to argue throughout the next few minutes that we're at a moment in time which many of the ideas that made us successful in the 20th century are actually going to work against our ability to understand how to perform in the 21st century. So first of all, let me kind of step back and look at this big context, or I'm going to call it our context, but the big shift. And that big shift I'm going to claim has to do with shifting from a predictable world of equilibrium, moving into an exponential world of constant flux and disequilibrium. I'm going to argue that the notion of equilibrium has gone. We will never see that again in the lifetime of anybody here. What this means is going to be, I think, profound for how we want to look at education, learning, media, and so on. In fact, if you think about our 21st century infrastructure, it is driven by exponential rules, exponential laws, Moore's law, bandwidth law, and so on and so forth. These laws, in fact, show no sign of slowing. The fact that they aren't showing any sign of slowing is, I think, a big deal. Yes, Moore's law, in a limited sense, is slowing down, but we're changing architectures, we're moving to multi and many core processors, we're changing the ways we do algorithms and so on and so forth. That is, in fact, speeding up the capabilities of our technology, not slowing them down. Now, the curious thing to some of us has been, if you look at over the last 300 to 400 years, if not forever, the infrastructures that define how we do things, the infrastructures on which we build our institutional mechanisms and so on and so forth, such as the university and the whole notion of what a capitalistic society is about, basically it's been driven by, I'm going to call it an S-curve. That's to say, for long moments, for long periods of time, you have stability, you have a punctuated evolution, and then after that, you have long periods of stability in which around that top part of the S-curve, we reinvent social practices, work practices, organizational practices, and often even political practices. I want us to reflect a moment. What does it mean if we're now entering a world which basically sees one punctuated move after another almost every 2 years? Personally speaking, I came into this game and I do a lot of work in cloud computing. I thought that, man, this is really going to be cool. I want to get my head around this, ... And what happens 18 months later, we introduce, everybody in this room knows, massive capabilities of graphic processing units, GPUs. Well, GPUs turn out to be amazingly specialized, amazingly powerful processors that are in fact very hard to stick into the cloud because we can't get the wide data paths we need to feed these 4 to 5 to 6 to 10,000 processor core processing systems. So all of a sudden, here I thought I was king of how to think about cloud computing. 1 year later, GPUs blow up the architectures we were thinking about, and you'll see a bunch of us scrambling now how to put GPUs, the big powerful GPUs that only cost $200 but still big, into our cloud architectures. This game is one of constant change. And I want to argue that, in fact, the big claim is that civilization has never seen a game like we're now entering, where there is no termination that we see ahead in terms of these rapid flux, rapid changes. So you might ask, come on, JP, I'm not here to learn about economics or how to build institutional or capitalistic architectures. But wait a moment. If this world of constant and accelerating flux is true, guess what? The half-life of any particular skill is shrinking. And in fact, today, as we teach our kids, most of the skills we teach them may have a half-life of around 5 years. Perhaps more importantly, virtually every strategic architecture in our corporate world is based on how to preserve the current value of stocks. I want to argue that, in fact, we're now in a big shift where we're moving to taking our eye off of the view of just preserving, safeguarding, protecting stocks, keeping things as they were, to now how do we really move toward embracing change in terms of learning how to participate on the edge of interesting flows. The shift from stocks to flows. The shift from saving the old and protecting it to actually moving into a new kind of participation, of things on the edge. Now the catch is the world is constantly changing faster and faster and faster. Guess what? Basically, learning has a lot more to do with creating the new rather than just learning the old. But if you're constantly creating the new, much of what you're creating has a very strong tacit component. We are used to saving, passing around, delivering, teaching the explicit, not the tacit. It takes time to codify what can be codified from an experience in order to pass it around in terms of the explicit. If we're living in a world where more and more of the things that need to be shared are the tacit, how does this change the very notions of how we want to build systems? How does it change how we want to think about immersive learning and so on and so forth? So I think these are some challenges we have. And on top of that, if we have a world of constant flux, constant change, we shouldn't overlook something. Maybe the most important thing we have to worry about in our students, et cetera, is how do we afford curiosity? Because basically, if you're not curious, you're screwed in a world of constant flux. And in fact, many of our kids start out in the world incredibly curious. How do we honor that curiosity in the way we run our own school systems? But what I find so interesting is these devices that we're now using, iPads, iPhones, iTouch, et cetera, I think we ought to think about these things not primarily as communication devices, but as basically curiosity amplifiers. Almost any conversation I've had in the last 2 or 3 days have brought up new ideas. I didn't quite know what that term meant, especially if you hang around with Dana. And so what happens? You have to actually grab up your iPhone, get on the net, look it up. Sometimes surreptitiously, sometimes explicitly, but think of these things in terms of how, no matter where we are, we're always on, always connected. And when something new is said, we can immediately pull that up, and that actually starts to shift the conversation. So all of a sudden, I think we're now entering a whole world of technological artifacts that help us think about how to actually amplify curiosity of our own selves and of our students. So I want to argue in the 21st century, perhaps we have to prepare our students, and maybe just ourselves, for this world of constant change. And everyone in this room knows what it's been like to fight with your faculty, to fight with your administration in terms of what does it mean to say, oh, you might have to change your curriculum. Oh, you might actually have to think about multimedia. Well, please teach me everything, as opposed to a spirit of saying, no, let's get in there together and figure this stuff out. But I want to step back and say perhaps now we need to rethink how we learn, especially if the tacit is more meaningful than ever or more important than ever, what we need to learn, and how media, new media, has changed this game in some very fundamental ways. So let's step back a moment and think a little bit about kind of what you might call 19th century models of learning, which are still with us to a large extent today. And that has to do with kind of a Cartesian view of learning. I think, therefore I am. Pedagogy has to do with knowledge transfer. Sophisticated pedagogy has to do with designing ideal impedance matches between the pictures we want to pour knowledge from into that matches the kid's head. Knowledge is a substance, pedagogy is transfer, and so on and so forth. And I think all of us in this room have probably adopted what I'm going to call more a social view of learning. And that is, it's not that I think, therefore I am, but it's rather we participate, therefore we are. And by the way, this obviously has deep psychoanalytic roots in terms of object relation theory. We come into being by our relationship to other. We discover ourselves by relationships with others, and so on and so forth. But that never stops. From this point of view, understanding is socially constructed. This is not a postmodern claim. This is simply a claim that I come to make knowledge personal. Learning has to do with making knowledge personal. And I make it personal by using it. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to have a conversation about it. And I often do this in terms of a social construction. So my understanding, not the knowledge itself, but my understanding is socially constructed. And guess what? One of the few deep, robust results in education, in fact, one of the few robust results in education has to do with there is nothing better than beating the compete study groups. In fact, a beautiful study was done at Harvard, reproduced elsewhere, said what's the best predictor of how well a kid will do in college? It is not their SATs, it is not their GPAs, it is not anything like that, but rather what is it? It is their ability to form or join study groups. If you can do that, you're going to win. Beginning and end of story. And in fact, that's not surprising given what was also said here a moment ago, because there's no better way to learn than trying to explain it to someone else. These study groups work in kind of a peer-to-peer type of a teaching, peer-to-peer type of a learning, peer-to-peer type of mentoring. This is how a study group actually works. And many of us now know that these study groups can work virtually as well as physically. Especially if they start off physically, they can easily move to IM chat rooms and so on and so forth. In fact, when I was first blown over by an observation close to this, is I was giving a talk some years ago in Chicago. I'm talking about games. I'll come back to games in a little bit, but I was talking about games. And this mother runs up to me and says, "Oh, John, I have this terrible, terrible problem with my son. And I'm all prepared for discussions about World of Warcraft, et cetera." And she says, "John, no, guess what? All my son wants to do is study. I'm just stressed out about this." And I said, "Well, this is certainly an interesting problem. Could we deconstruct that, unpack that a little bit? Can you tell me more about what's going on?" And she said, "Oh, no, my son runs home, dashes upstairs, runs in his room, closes his door, gets on the machine, and starts studying." And I said, "Oh, this is very interesting." Now trying to be more gentle, I said, "Oh, do you sometimes go in his room?" She said, "Oh, yes, no, I go in his room all the time." I said, "Well, when you walk into this room, does the screen immediately go blue?" She said, "Oh, no." I said, "Well, what do you see?" And she says, "I have 6, 7, 8 windows he has open all the time. And what's going on is he dashes home to join this study group, virtual study group. And in fact, they are socializing and solving problems together amongst his friends all together." And in a very interesting way, what this kid discovered, and many of us have discovered, is that there is a rich social life to learning. And in fact, we can't tear these two things apart. So the technologies that maybe were meant initially for the social life become just as important in terms of letting me make knowledge personal and to enable a kind of peer-based learning. Okay, if that's true, we can probably extend this a lot of ways. But guess what? It can be misunderstood. And I know some of you in this room know this, but I was blown away by one more example. Ryerson University, and how they didn't really get the social life of learning. And there was a room in Ryerson University called Dungeons, where kids got together to study organic chemistry. And Chris Evanier actually created, around that idea, a Facebook group. And this was a Facebook group called Dungeons Mastering Chemistry Solutions. And they had about 146 kids in that study group on Facebook. And lo and behold, the university discovered that and filed 146 counts of academic misconduct to Chris, and actually proceeded to throw him out of school. You can believe that this became an interesting court case in terms of looking at how this could be, and basically the quote-unquote case against him, calling it a court case, I wouldn't go quite that far, but the case against him ended up, the argument was 3 things. Learning should be hard. Now, if you can believe that, most of us in this room are trying to make learning seamless to everything else we're doing. So learning should be hard. Second, there is no structure of regulation for online behavior, and that makes it incompatible with academic work. And third, the argument that went, It is our job to protect academic integrity from any threat. In other words, unless learning is hard and is directed by others, it fails to meet the standard for academic rigor. And the kid was thrown out. Well, fortunately, not too long afterwards, this case was reviewed, and in a actually 7-page ruling, the engineering faculty appeals committee found no proof that the Facebook group was cheating. Students had not been using the Facebook group to cheat. Instead, they had been using it as a collaborative problem-solving tool in terms of now extending the virtual to the study group, to the virtual study group, to a social space of honest-to-God, authentic problem-solving. And guess what? Suddenly doing organic chemistry problems was fun. And that's, by the way, is not a bad achievement for those of you that understand what that's really like. So, you know, a very simple warning is, of course, learning and educating are not the same thing. And we have a lot of routines for what we think education is. Much of our educational institutions don't think much about what learning is. And we have to be now aware in terms of the world of the big shift, where flux is here. How do we move from, as I open my opening slide, from a 19th century model of teaching and education to a 21st century model of learning? And maybe we could actually make learning fundamentally fun and fulfilling. So I wanted to start out down this path. I wanted to look at 2 extreme cases of extreme performance and extreme learning, and see what we might be able to learn from each of these cases in terms of rethinking at a more epistemological and even ontological basis what this game is becoming. Now, most people, when they see that slide, expect me to bring up some obscure thing about nanotechnology from the work I did at Park recently and so on and so forth. But in fact, I'm going to go the opposite direction. I'm going to talk about an amazing thing that's happened. Here are 6 kids. 5 of them I've had the pleasure to study. These are the little grommets of Maui. Now, most of you might not realize that Maui, a Hawaiian island, has never in its history produced a world champion surfer. Yes, Hawaii has, Oahu on the North Shore, they have produced some great surfers, but never a champion coming out of Maui. Not too long ago, a few years ago, there was this 14-year-old kid. Actually, before that, this picture was taken. This is about, he was 8, 9 here. But when he was 14, his dad said, Dusty, kid holding the medal, Dusty, what do you want to be when you grow up? And Dusty said, it's totally clear. I'm going to become a professional surfer. And Dusty's father, Wendell, being responsible, tried to explain to Dusty that this is not a good idea, that this is a fun thing to do, but you don't make a living on this, and so on and so forth. And Dusty looked to his dad and said, Dad, you don't get it. I don't care. I am going to become a professional surfer. In fact, I'm going to become a world champion. So his dad and his mother, Lisa, said, okay, we'll support you then. And what Dusty did is he went out and he found 4 other cohorts. It's actually everybody except that first one. And what we're going to do is we're going to build a quote-unquote study group. No, he didn't use those terms, believe me. We're going to build a cohort group. And what we're going to do is we're going to compete and we're going to collaborate together as an intense group to try to protect and perfect our skills to the extreme. Well, at 20, Dusty became a world champion. From this incredible notion of peer-based learning in this cohort group. But if it was just Dusty, I wouldn't be here talking because we all have idiot savants around. perhaps more interesting, is every single one of these kids is now a world champion. All 5. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration. 4. The 5th one is today considered by many of us the best surfer in the world. But he has Asperger's disease. And he can't communicate, and he can't socialize, and he doesn't like to leave home. And in fact, quite honestly, he doesn't like to get out of the water. He comes alive in the water if you want to interview him or anything like that. So these 5 kids pulled themselves up by their bootstraps through a form of kind of learning collaboratively together and competing collaboratively together to each one become a world champion. So let's deconstruct for a moment what actually, oh, by the way, I meant to show you some examples of Dusty. I don't know how many of you surf in this room. In this room, you probably have some at least. But by the way, notice that surfboards don't have straps. So if you start to do aerial surfing, these kids actually push the whole genre of aerial surfing. And let me show you briefly a short movie of Dusty. And then I want to kind of deconstruct what's really going on here. That's getting tricky. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but near the very end, it looked like he was going to come down on top of somebody. Okay, well, that was a photographer. Okay, now Dusty, being a smart kid, has figured out how to make some money off this game, and he sells real estate. The real estate he sells is space on his board. And guess what's the most expensive real estate? It's the bottom of the board. That's where he puts the most expensive logos, because basically that's where photographers want to grab, as he does a spectacular aerial, double twist, and so on and so forth. And in fact, Dusty just won, for one of these moves, $50,000 in like 3 minutes by perfecting one. And in fact, Dusty now makes considerably more than his dad. Now, I've had the chance to study these guys because, fortunately, they live 300 feet from me in Maui. So I've had a lot of time with these, especially with Dusty. And I just want to talk a little bit about what goes on here with him, because it comes back to social media in some surprising ways. The first thing is these kids have an amazing passion to become extreme performers, which means that they're willing to fail, fail, fail constantly in order to get some new move right. And by the way, failing out there looks innocent. It ain't innocent. Some of those things you don't want to fail in because it's kind of bad. Those waves have a lot of power in them. How they started with this cohort group when they were 14 is they grabbed all the DVDs and video they could get of the best surfers in the world, and they went through this thing frame by frame by frame, analyzing each move that these guys were making. And then what they would do, they would analyze this, by the way, in Dusty's living room. And as soon as they kind of saw a new idea, what would they do? They grab their surfboard, run down the hill, which is 300 feet, jump in the water, and try it out. And they would watch each other, and they critique each other. Then after they got all those things mastered, they started, of course, inventing their own moves. And so they ended up using, of course, their own video equipment in order to be able to video what they were doing. As soon as they video what they were doing, they would run up as a group and again go frame by frame with their own moves and their own videos that they were constructing to try to figure out what was working and what wasn't. Now, mind you, in this game, when you're on the surfboard, you're not thinking. You know, you are in the moment to the extreme. You're doing things you don't even know that you're doing. And to give you some sense, a good move today in the surfing world will take less than 48 hours to circulate the entire world. Every major surfer will pick up something every 48 hours if it's a major move by a champion player. And it's wonderful to see because the surfers themselves, until it starts to circulate around the world, don't necessarily quite know what they've done. But Dusty's cohort group were fantastic in terms of deconstructing each other, although they wouldn't exactly use that word. Another thing they would do is they would look for adjacencies all the time. This happens actually here in Southern California as well. The hardcore surfers, well, not down here, but down the street a ways. And what they look for is kind of adjacent fields. For example, skateboarding. Well, skateboarding is obvious, windsurfing is obvious, snowboarding is kind of obvious, mountain biking is a little bit less obvious, even motocrossing. In fact, one of the most recent moves in the professional surfing circuit is called the Superman, which I think actually Dusty first did that one. And he got this idea from watching a motocross. A motocross over a lift, you actually let the motorcycle fly out in front of you and you fly behind the motorcycle. It's not that hard to do if a motorcycle has its own power, which obviously it does. Now mapping that over, appropriating it in this new space is a very interesting move. And that is what Dusty ended up perfecting. And I think the last thing I comment on here with these guys is they have this notion, and they deeply understand, is there are spikes of incredible capability around the world. So how do they learn? Is they travel from spike to spike to spike. And each one of these hotspots, they're now pretty well known. They participate in all kinds of conversations. They look at how they're shaping their boards, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, actually, Dusty shapes his boards up here in Santa Barbara. And they pick up ideas anywhere. And that movement, that idea of kind of attracting people now to them, to give them ideas as they reciprocate in giving ideas back, turned out to be, to me, an extremely interesting kind of learning space writ large, but one that traffics to a very large extent in the tacit. And in fact, what you see here is a passionate pursuit of not just passion, but extreme performance with, I'm going to call it a deep questing disposition. So one bottom line is, if we want to prepare our students for the 21st century of a world of flux, perhaps it's not a skill that matters, it's a disposition. How do we prepare our students with a questing disposition? And on top of that, what you see here is a commitment to indwelling, coming from the tacit notions of Polanyi. The question is, it is immersion in, not about, what these kids are doing. They're marinating in the phenomena. I'm going to come back to that. And that marination in turns out to be a very key thing. But without digital media, in fact, these kids would not have been able to swap ideas, because to look at a verbal description of what goes on does not cut it. Because it takes a long time for them to really figure out what the kind of moves really were, the balancing moves, and the most minor shift, even where their hand is, where their feet are, and so on, underlies almost everything they do. So I want to look at a second extreme example of performance. I want to look at this because, in fact, I've become very interested in how might you actually generate exponential learning. Most of the kinds of learnings we do actually have diminishing returns. Most learnings we do, at best, kind of move ahead a little bit as a linear if they don't have diminishing returns. We're now capable of showing that in the world of Warcraft, we have exponential learning. And one of the first times you're being able to measure exponential learning. But first, let's look at World of Warcraft a moment. And I think everybody in this room understands that these things are virtual spaces, but they're also social spaces. But most important to me, they are sites of joint collective agency. And that's critical. Joint collective agency. In that sense, they come very close to the essence of a community of practice, but these are virtual communities, and without the joint sense of agency, these things would not work with stories I'm going to be able to tell you. But I also want to caution us right away to see the value of these games. Do not get obsessed looking at the game. Don't just look at the core of the game, but pay equally close attention, in some cases for me, even more attention, to the social life on the edge of the game. There's the core game, and there's the edge game. And we often call that edge a knowledge economy, and you'll see why in a moment. To many of us that study World of Warcraft, it is the knowledge economy on the edge that turns out to be so suggestive. And deconstructing what's going on that edge gives us a lot of new ideas in terms of how to drive learning in new ways. And in fact, I think one of the things that surprised me the most is when I started interviewing with, like Thomas, a lot of these kids playing World of Warcraft, there was a very simple mantra that came out. The mantra is, if I'm not learning, I'm out of here. It ain't fun. And it's interesting how learning became basically reasons what was driving them, the ability to constantly perfect their skills and thereby their sense of identity in the space, and where they could actually measure how much they were learning. In fact, the gamer is surprisingly very bottom line oriented. They want to be measured. Why? Because they want to see themselves, how much are they progressing, and so on and so forth. But I want to argue in the World of Warcraft, as we look at it, there are two kinds of learning spaces. There's in-game learning, and there is out-of-game learning. That's to say, there's learning that comes from about, being above, which is basically what every education course is about. And there is also in-game learning in terms of being in the moment, in the game, so to speak. Let's first look at the in-game learning, because the in-game learning is, in fact, a kind of collective indwelling. You don't think that much about what's going on, but what you're doing is in the game, you're constantly experimenting. You're constantly tinkering. You're constantly playing around. And you do this kind of tinkering. This is, by the way, especially true in high-end raids, because you're really trying to get a gut feeling for how this system works. It is not knowledge about, it is knowledge that you actually don't even quite understand how you've embodied that knowledge in yourself. But to help you, you do use dashboards, because this game is so hopelessly complicated that you really can't play it effectively without complex analysis tools. And what's curious to me is these dashboards themselves are actually crafted by each player. They're mashups, and each particular player wants to mash up just how he or she wants to get data about how they're doing and how their team is doing in a high-end raid. These dashboards are complicated. But I want to show you a brief little video of a game and kind of notice something about this. There is no sound here. Don't worry, I won't bother to explain what's going on. It's kind of complicated. But what's so curious to me is you think about World of Warcraft, these spectacular graphics, all this kind of stuff. In fact, you can't even see most of what's going on. This game is being played at this moment through the dashboards. And so it's the dashboards that these kids are using to play the game in a very curious way. In fact, we've taken this idea about dashboards. These are dashboards created by the kids for themselves. Almost all mashups, individually crafted. We're now looking in the government, in the recovery and Gov 2.0 in terms of how do we think about building dashboards crafted by the employee for themselves, not their managers, as a way that they can begin to see what's going on here for themselves. And needless to say, after you engaged in a high-end raid, what then happens is you go into fairly intensive after-action reviews. And these after-action reviews are pretty interesting because each person is evaluated the same. I mean, the head of the raid team is evaluated just like everyone else. So it is a true meritocracy type of after-action review that's going on there. So in a curious way, what we see happening here is a new kind of collective virtual indwelling, where we're blending the tacit with the cognitive. We have been focusing on cognitive almost all our lives. I want to argue that in the world of constant flux, we have to spend much more time thinking about the tacit. And how does that actually work? It is that blend. And I want to argue that, in fact, a hell of a lot of our brain has never been tasked very much because, in fact, the cognitive is a very small part of what goes on in our brain. And we don't think about how to really exploit the tacit structures. And how do we actually start to build environments that really have this collective indwelling with, yes, a piece of reflection as well. So it's a sense of marinating in something that becomes so interesting to me. By the way, the second kind of learning is kind of out-of-game learning. And those of you that play World of Warcraft, I didn't actually have, because it got delayed last night, but I was going to check it to look at this. But a couple nights ago, there were probably 12,000 new ideas added to this economy on how to perfect your play. There are 12 million people playing this game, and there are at least 10,000 ideas a night that are being posted how to do better. And so it's a very interesting, by the way, some of these things that are posted are machinima. Here's an example of, this is actually, I don't want to go through it all, but this is a very major high-end raid game of how to get into and live through Tempest Keep. And this actually was the first time there'd been an attempt to try to capture some of the tacit skills that actually made them be able to kill the boss in this room. The catch, though, is what they're really using is a very interesting guild structure in which subgroups of the guild are responsible for doing certain kinds of processing. So they build a machine that is a social entity that actually is processing all this knowledge every single night, passing it through the guild, depending what they find, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, it'd be impossible for a high-end guild to be able to process this amount of information every day. And what we now can show is by kind of fusing together the kind of collective indwelling about being in simultaneously with about up here. Aboutness and inness have now been fused in this space. And that fusing has enabled us to now show that you get true exponential learning in this game. And the ability to show exponential learning is really quite unusual. In fact, we've never been able to measure before. And I just want to show one more example of this notion of indwelling. I want to look at speed chess. I could also talk about hardcore hacking. In speed chess, you might think that, in fact, we've seen some beautiful cases of this where the kids start out and one group says, I'm going to actually play these games, play all the masters, but I want to think through everything that I do. So they play chess as a very cognitive phenomenon. Another group actually says, I'm going to, in fact, play speed chess. I'm going to make a move every 30 seconds. And if you're making a move 30 seconds, the other group says, well, you can't think about what you're doing. That's true. You can't really think about what you're doing. Okay? Well, guess what? The kids that turn out to be world champions in chess, by and large, are the ones that have done speed chess. They are marinating in that space. They're using everything about their instincts, and they're perfecting their instincts. They're pulling together in their mind and their brain, integrating components in order to become this ability to see patterns that nobody's ever seen before. is curious of the power of speed chess as just a simple tip of the iceberg in terms of this notion of collective indwelling. So let me kind of step back and say, what is the big picture here? Because obviously we're not here to figure out how to play games better and better. I want to talk about first kind of a blended epistemology that everybody in this room is so used to, and that is how do you really take seriously the notion of combining Homo sapiens with Homo faber. Man as knower versus man as maker. Notion in the Homo sapiens world, tools are instruments in order to get something done. So Homo sapien isn't without interest about making, but basically their view of tools is how do I get something in, how do I get something done. In the Homo faber world, something else begins to happen. In the Homo faber world, you begin to think of tools as a device to engage in productive inquiry. In fact, in the Homo faber world, you might say, basically, when you find an answer to a question, that's just the next question. So answers become questions. And in fact, I like to think of, from Donald Schoen at MIT, that basically tools are a way to think about interpreting the back talk of the situation. You try to make something happen, it doesn't really quite work. Those of us in material, well, probably not here, material science, spend a lot of time listening to how the material is talking back to us if we can't get this structure to actually work. That sense of these tools as ways to amplify backtalk is a completely different idea. Although you can see it even in some of the videos you showed, Larry, before, is things aren't working quite right. Something is pushing back on you. How do you interpret that pushback in order to figure out how to kind of rework the soundtrack, how to do the fade differently, so on and so forth. But I want to add to this notion of Homo faber, Homo ludens, and Homo sapiens, the notion of Homo ludens. Man as player, a highly nuanced concept of play. And guess what? Just like how I opened this talk, one of the key ideas of play is the freedom to fail, fail, fail again until you get it right, just like I showed in the extreme sports. But also, it is a play of imagination. And think of the kinds of play that goes on in poetry or even hip-hop music. I mean, one of the things I find interesting in kids that are really good at hip-hop is they're constantly being attuned, going back to the notion of adjacencies, they're constantly attuned to turns of phrase that they see anywhere, and they will grab that turn of phrase and bring it into their own world and kind of mix it into what they're trying to do. So this play of imagination in poetry, music, imagery, and so on and so forth. And the other key thing about play, and you can see where I'm headed, I think, is that in play you can sometimes construct epiphanies, where suddenly, by playing things in your mind, everything suddenly falls in place. It's like solving a riddle. Now I want to make a simple assertion. You create or stage or afford an epiphany for a kid, that kid will never forget that for life. Epiphanies are things that stay with you. But we don't think much about how to afford and stage epiphanies. From this point of view, think about learning as riddles, leading to a reframing or re-registration or re-registering of the world. I don't want to go through Husseini's beautiful work, but play is also the progenitor of culture. Play first, culture second, not the other way around. A fairly deep idea. Let me give you an example of a simple framing. Here's a tiny riddle. Think about this riddle moment. A black dog is sleeping in the middle of a black road that has no street lights and there is no moon. A car coming down the road with its lights off steers around the dog. How did the driver know the dog was there? A simple riddle. Dangerous, you probably, any idea? No, I'm not going to ask you. You, any idea? Okay.
Woof, woof.
No, not woof woof, actually. Okay, he had the windows up. Who said it wasn't daylight? Okay, so the solution of the riddle is reframing it in terms of the context. I'm going to come back to context in a moment. But so there's a trivial, most trivial example of the reframing that actually happens. And you may never even forget this riddle, as trivial as it is. But you know, most riddles aren't quite so trivial. So I want to suggest we're actually beginning to engage in everyone in this room, and the kinds of things I saw in the videos you showed before I got up here, is kind of extending a blended epistemology beyond just Homo sapiens and Homo faber, but also bringing in Homo ludens, man as knower, maker, and player, putting them all together. But notice something. We think we know what maker is, but you guys, at least as much as I, maybe more, realize there's something new here. In new media, the system becomes more than just the thing. We can now make context as much as we can make content. And given that meaning emerges as much from context as content, this truly opens up a new dimension of meaning creation. Now, at some level, this is obvious. We all know, and many of us use this kind of a thing in our classes, is you give me a movie and let me change the soundtrack to that movie. And guess what? It obviously, or not obviously, but it changes not only often the meaning of that movie, but it also changes actually what you do see. Because for a dramatic effect, you take Jurassic Park, you know, when that dinosaur crunches that person, go back and carefully look at that. It never happens. The sound makes it sound like it happened. Everybody swears that they saw it. They didn't. It's not there. It's cut just at the right moment. You fill it in, which makes it more dramatic, and that crafting the context is what creates something you will never forget. So suddenly this notion of extending Homo faber from content to context is, in fact, a lot about what we are here. And now think about blogging. Blogging is joint context creation. We might think about blogging as content creation, but I want to talk about it as context creation. I want to quote Andy Sullivan's beautiful article in Atlantic Monthly, etc. The blogger is, more than any writer of the past, a node among other nodes, connected but unfinished without the links in the comments and the trackbacks that make the blogosphere at its best a conversation rather than a production. To Andy, blogging is like jazz. Jazz and blogging are intimate, improvisational, and individual, but also inherently collective. The audience talks over both. And we want to think about that, of content and context, and how we have the tools now. But now the tools for crafting context isn't quite as simple as just changing the music track. In order to know how to shape the context, you have to know how to make things go semi-viral. You have to be able to build up an audience that it will participate, and so on and so forth. So the shaping of context becomes an amazingly interesting skill to think how that actually happens. And if you don't think that way, you're not going to be effective in the blogosphere. And so this is a very interesting game, not game, but kind of issue of how do you think of this notion of jazz, working with each other in terms of your audience, trying out provisional ideas, and engaging in a collective conversation that actually happens. So I really want to argue is that, in fact, if we take this extended epistemology seriously, in terms of Homo sapien, Homo faber, Homo ludens, what we really have here is a new notion of deep tinkering, playing in its deepest sense at making, testing, trying, riddling the system as thing and context simultaneously. In fact, I was struck last night, always eventful encounters with little Miss Dana. And she got me to go look at 4chan. And after that, I started thinking about, here is a group that knows how to kind of hack the attention economy in terms of constructing a deep interplay between context and content. A new form of hacking, a new form of how to make things go viral, et cetera, et cetera. This may become a key part of a new kind of digital literacy. So this interplay between how do you craft or how do you afford context, you craft meaning, you probably afford context, how these things come together becomes very interesting. And today's students, or today's literate folks, can probably at least intuit, if not explicitly understand this game. So I want to end with one simple idea about a culture of learning. I want to argue that when recreation becomes an act of recreation, remix, and productivity, and productive inquiry, we actually have on the forefront the steps to creating a culture of learning, a culture that thrives on participatory, lifelong learning, and a quest to always become. Thank you.